stereotypes. And we're going to talk about where these stereotypes come from. We're going to talk about the cultural and familial expectations that are placed upon us because of our specific genders. And we're going to talk about, well, what do we want to define ourselves as? How do we look beyond these gender roles? And how can we have a voice in being who we want to be? This is us. My name is Joie. I go by she or they pronouns. I have around 14, 15 years of community organizing experience. I do a lot of community outreach, community engagement. I run a DEI consulting firm called CORE, which is what we're presenting to you from. And I do a bunch of other community work. And then I'll hand it over to Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben. My pronouns are he and his, and I work for ASLP Public Schools. This is a charter network within Denver with 16 different schools from ages 6th grade to 12th. And then what I do there is I do marketing communication systems and a lot of data analysis and interesting analysis, especially around like diverse populations and the percentage of folks in those communities. So moving forward from here, these are some of our discussion guidelines. So I'm just going to read them out really quick. So number one, be vulnerable and open with your answers and stories. So we ask you to maybe step outside of your comfort zone and move into like a brave space and start exploring what are some maybe difficult topics, especially when we're talking about our gender roles. Number two, the stories heard here, stay here, and the lessons learned here, leave here. So as for stories, maybe people are going to be sharing information about themselves. Maybe they're going to share personal anecdotes. So we want to respect that person's privacy and keep that story here. But the lesson that you learn from that story can leave here. And I hope you learn something and you take it out with you. Okay. 3, everyone is encouraged to participate within their own comfort level. We don't want to push you, but if you feel uncomfortable, definitely take it at your own pace. And then listen to and respect other points of view. Okay, there's going to be different points of view here, and we want to be open and honest with how we're feeling. Okay, and then does anyone have maybe 1 or 2 more guidelines that they want to jump out with? Anything else? Everyone feel okay with these as a guideline for our discussion today? Raise your hand if you're okay with this. Great. All right. And moving forward, so now we're going to be talking about some stereotypes. And so
anyone else?
Just want to acknowledge the fact that we're going to be looking at this at a very Western lens. And so oftentimes through this Western lens, it's going to be a very binary kind of view, right? And so as a binary view, the first question we're going to ask you here are, what are some stereotypes of Asian American women and men?
So you can think about this, in terms of the larger society, how people may have perceived you. We can think about this in like media, like film and television. How do you see women and men being portrayed that are of Asian American background? Yes.
I feel like Asian women are kind of exoticized sometimes.
Yes. So exoticized, they're made to seem as very different, right? They're made to seem as very foreign, as something that isn't Western, right? It's other, it's different. Other thoughts? Yes.
This is something that is not exactly as true with more of the newer generations, but Asian men were kind of a little favored in the family, you know what I mean? Like all the older generation would really favor all of the grandsons or the sons in the family. So I don't know exactly why, but I just
Yes, like a emphasis of higher perceived value of men in the family.
Kind of like patriarchal. Sure, what else?
In Western lens and how they view Asians, they often emasculate them. They're never the main character. They're kind of a very side character a lot of times. They're not portrayed as the go-getter, or they're just quiet or reserved.
And then how would you define emasculate?
When you think of for instance, action movies, you think of the very buff, main characters, Batman's, whatever. But when they have Asian characters alongside them, they're either the side characters, they're a lot lankier, they're less they're side characters, and it got better with Spider-Man, like Ned and stuff, and
Mhm.
like the Filipino representation. But for instance, like he was kind of a side
Mm.
comedy relief character to Tom Holland's Spider-Man in the first 2 movies or so.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So we see Asian American men often sidelined, and then from what I understand, emasculation being seen as they're not strong, right? They do not live up to the Western expectations of what it means to be a man. And I think that's something that we can like dig deeper into because there's a Western definition of what it means to be a man, and there's also a lot of different other definitions. But according to the way the media portrays Asian American men, it is someone that is effeminate, that is weak, that doesn't rise up to the occasion, that isn't the hero, and things of that sort. Would that be an accurate summary? Okay.
Awesome, over here.
Oh yeah, kind of, it's the same as what you just said, so it's kind of like desexualized, especially through a lot of Western portrayals, so Asian American man does not live up to the white European ideals of men. And we see especially in those like lots of older Hollywood movies like 16 Candles.
Yes. Yeah.
It's very typical.
Yeah. So they're desexualized, meaning they are never the romantic interest. They are not sexually or romantically desirable, right? And then if folks are not familiar, 16 Candles was a huge coming of age film, I think from the 80s. And there was this character there called Lam Dup Dong, which I don't even know if it's an actual like Asian name. I think they just put a bunch of sounds together. And in that, he is incredibly awkward. He is kind of gross to white women because he wants to be with them. And he is seen as like effeminate and just weird. Like no one wants to be around him.
Yeah, I feel like another example would be Raj from Big Bang Theory. Like
Raj,
he doesn't have a love interest throughout the entire show. Like all the other white male love interests, but he's the only one who's like weird or awkward.
Yeah, but like everyone's a nerd in the Big Bang Theory, right? Why is only Raj that doesn't get to have a love interest? Good point. Yeah.
I think for the desexualizing, I think it's the same for women, where Asian women are often fetishized and they're not seen as like sexy or mature. It's not like something that says that they're seen more like submissive, innocent, and like childlike kind of like I view of women in Asian cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So I think women are also shown to be very domestic. As in, like, they're serving men.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that we see really often, and maybe not as much anymore, but of course we do see some of it, is that Asian women are perceived to be sexual objects that exist for the pleasure of white men, or men as a whole, right? And that's something that we see quite often in media and film. And it's something that I think we're still trying to move out of, but still have some ways to go. Other thoughts?
3 minutes. Anything else?
I think like sometimes they're not portrayed as leaders unless it's like an Asian specific film. Like if it's a film that's just like a mix of people, they're usually not the leaders, whether it's like a man or a woman.
I agree, yeah. And then before we move on, I want to ask folks, maybe 1 or 2 people answer, how does this make you feel? How does this make you feel that when the only times that you see people that look like you on screen, they are put into these stereotypes? I mean, I'm sure people don't feel good about it, right?
A little bit like ostracized, and you always feel like different, and then growing up, you're always seeing yourself in different light as never blending in.
Yeah, as not being part of this society, right? As being different and foreign and not at the same level, right, as your peers. Thank you. Does one more person want to share how these make them feel or their reactions to it? Is any of this shocking to people? No? Okay, well, we don't have to have one person. We can just hop into it. All right. So the next 6 slides are basically like a crash course into history. I'm going to let you know now, it's going to go by fast, but we want to fit a lot of information in. So these stereotypes, I want folks to know, these stereotypes are not new. We might perceive them through a modern lens, but these stereotypes have a very, very, very long history that goes back into the very first interactions that we have of the Western world meeting with the Eastern world. They are a legacy of racism that has been around for quite some time. And what I mean by that is we're going to go into women and the history of Asian American women stereotypes. And I'll go through that history for you. I'll go through a bit of the ramifications, and then we will switch over to the same with men. Understandably, it's a bit binary, but we're talking about stereotypes here, right? And the Western world does work a lot in a binary way. So the history of Asian women fetishization. I want folks to take away from this slide that there is a direct link between Western imperialism and the fetishization of Asian women. When we look back to when we first see the Western world be in contact with the Eastern world, we see these discussions about how the Eastern world is different, it's foreign, it's backwards, it's uncivilized, right? And then when we see during Western imperialism, specifically looking at World War II and the time period surrounding that, there was a lot of Western military occupation in Asia, right? You see this in Vietnam, you see this in Korea. Specifically, the example we're talking about here is going to be in Japan in World War II. So after World War II, Japan was occupied by several thousands of Western military men. Anytime a military occupies anywhere in the world, any type of military, I want folks to know that there is always rape, right? People will just say that rape and pillaging is back from the Viking days, right? It's not only then, there is always that going on. And it was a huge issue during World War II. Just in Okinawa alone, over 10,000 women reported rape by GIs, by American GIs. It became such an enormous issue that the Japanese government actually created a Recreation and Amusement Association to basically legalize sex work to provide entertainment for American men. So that's the move that they decided to take because this was such a rampant issue. And then so what they saw is that they recruited over 55,000 women to serve as sex workers. These women, sure, there may be some that did so consensually, that they wanted to do these things, but it's important to know a lot of these women were coerced. They were promised something different, and in a lot of ways were forced into these positions. And so what you see during this time period, right, during this Western imperialism time period, is the Western world going into Asia. They're dominating these countries. And what is total domination but the domination of the woman there, right? And you have to really recognize the sort of power differential that's being in play here about what it means to truly win, what it truly means to win a war, right? And so you have this already brewing in the minds of the Western world that Asian women exist for the pleasure of white men. Back home, going back in time a little bit, we see this happening very often too on American soil. Specifically, one of the first federal restrictive immigration acts was the Page Act of 1875. Basically, there was a growing Chinese population in America and people weren't having it. They didn't like Chinese people here. They didn't want them here. One of the first things that they did to stop it is they passed the Page Act. The Page Act basically said, we don't want any more Chinese women here because all of them are sex workers. How did they determine if Chinese women were sex workers? Well, they had some extensive interviews with these women. And then sometimes they would just look at photographs of these women and they'll say, oh, this woman is pretty. And so I believe she's a sex worker. And that is also how you start to see in the Western psyche, how they perceive Asian women, right? How they perceive Asian women, again, to be sexually compliant and only existing for the sexual pleasure of men. And what we see is that around the 1880s, the population of the Chinese immigrants was about 90% Chinese men because there was no women that were being let in. And then before I move on, this slide right here is US servicemen walking into the government brothel, Yasura. You can see how massive this crowd is. It can give you an idea of the scope of this that was going on. And then, so moving into today, we did a really, really big jump, right? We talked about the history of it, But I wanted to mention that history so folks understand that our stereotypes today don't come from nothing. They come from our history, right? And a lot of stereotypes that we see with Asian women today, we've actually already listed earlier. But the Asian women are seen as exotic, they're seen as sexualized, and they're in service to white men, right? Specifically, the example that we have here is Lucy Liu in Kill Bill. And I want to put a disclaimer that you can like these films, you can like these shows and still acknowledge that there are problematic aspects to it. Because I mean, I'm also talking about myself because I really like Kill Bill. And I can also acknowledge that this was not a great representation of Asian women, right? And that's about having good media literacy. And something I want to underline is that Asian fetishization, the obsession with Asian women and Asian women's sexuality is not something new, and it has definitely not gone away. And specifically, what are the ramifications of this? I want people to take away from this slide particularly that Asian fetishization is not a compliment, right? When people say they have yellow fever, it is not a compliment. And I think growing up, sometimes I had this notion that when people said that they liked Asian women or they liked Asians specifically, that it was something good, right? And I was like, oh, okay, well, it's better than being ostracized. It's better than people thinking that I'm like this backwards, like dog eating person, like at least they like me, right? But I want folks to know that is not a compliment, okay? Fetishization is rooted in racism, sexism, and classism. It removes a person's characteristics and uniqueness only to be replaced by stereotypes of their racial background. So when someone says that they have yellow fever or they like Asian women, the question is why? What about Asian women do you like? And then what specifically, what characteristics about Asian women do you like? And then once more you ask about that, you'll notice that they'll say things, oh, like Asian women are more subservient, you know, they're more likely to do domestic work. They want to please their partners, right? And you'll see that this concept of Asian fetishization comes directly from the stereotypes that we have about Asian women. And the ramifications of it are incredibly serious. I want folks to know that fetishization directly leads to violence. Fetishization is linked to violence. I believe there's over 20% of Asian American women are at risk for domestic violence. I want folks to sort of think about when you perceive a person to be a certain type of attributes, when you perceive them to be subservient, dominant, and pleasing you, what happens when they are not, right? What happens when they don't meet these expectations? Specifically, something that you might be familiar with, that there was a shooting in Atlanta in 2021 where a man went to a massage parlor and it was mostly Asian women, and he shot up the parlor. 6 out of the 8 victims that passed away were Asian women. At that time, he had said, I did this because I have a sex addiction. It had nothing to do with race. But we have to really question this. Why did this man decide to go to an Asian massage parlor for his sex addiction? Why is that, right? It is because the association that Asian American women at massage parlors were sex workers, and sex workers were a issue for him in the sense that it would increase or not help his sex addiction, right? And I think the discourse is really important to note that it isn't only about gender, that this crime was also about race. Something that we see is also a really big ramification of this is the continued use of rampant sex tourism in Southeast Asia, in Asia in general. If you're not familiar with what sex tourism is, it is basically what you might think it is. It is basically folks being tourists, doing tourist things, and those tourist things is buying sex. So you'll have a lot of these white older men going to these countries to buy sex with young Asian girls, many of which might not even be there consensually, many of which who are underage, right? And this is a legacy directly of that Western imperialism, when Western occupation directly led to rape and the forced sex work of several thousand young girls. And I want folks to take away from this. One, stereotypes that we see today have a historic background. They don't just come out of thin air. And 2, there are very real consequences of it. It's not just saying, oh, I oh, there's just these funny stereotypes about us in film. No, there are direct consequences. It leads to the violence and it leads to the complete disrespect of a woman, Asian woman, locally and abroad. Any questions on this? I know I zoomed by very, very fast. How are folks feeling? Is this surprising to you? Is this new? Is this coming too fast? Is it too slow? Can you give me a thumbs up? We're good to go? Good to move forward? Don't need to cover anything else here? Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Ben to talk about the other side of the coin.
Right, going back to the binary. So for history of Asian American men stereotypes, so especially during the 1800s, when you're looking at Manifest Destiny, you're looking at the Gold Rush, and you're looking at immigrants being sent over, a lot of East Asian men were being sent to the Americas to find different possibilities, different futures for their families. And oftentimes the men that were being sent are going to be the most intelligent, the most able, and the most able to carry forward for their families and provide, right? And so during this time, a lot of what was happening is the stereotypes that kind of came out of it. So a lot of Asian men that were coming over were portrayed in a very negative light. The perception was that they were here to basically take over, invade, and they were a threat. So the concept of the yellow peril stereotype came in the 1800s, late 1800s. And what's being seen specifically is that they were a threat to that general, to white women, to white men, to white society. And so during this time, there were several anti-miscegenation acts that prevented folks from actually doing interracial marriages. So whether that was with Asian Americans, whether it was Black Americans, or it's going to be Indigenous Americans, this is something that was barred heavily. And then in the early 1900s, a lot of times, the only labor that was available at first was going to be mining, right? So for the gold rush, you're only able to work in these mines, but then a lot of white folks felt like they were losing jobs because of this. And so a lot of Chinese men were actually forced into more feminine work. So that's when they had to move towards laundromats, move towards cooking, cleaning, and tailoring. And so when we look at this snippet of history, you can see East Asian men being pushed into a certain role, and a certain mindset, and a certain perception. And then even here in the Yellow Terror editorial cartoon 1899, you see here a very common caricature of like a Chinaman, right? And right here, they're standing over a white woman. And so it kind of bleeds in that terror. It bleeds in that evil and sexually deviant mindset that Asian men are dangerous and they don't belong here. They're foreign aspects. So how that manifests itself today, okay? So when we're looking at, Ned from Spider-Man, when we're looking at different characters like 16 Candles, right? And we're looking at some of these traits that kind of come through. Some of that comes from the model minority myth, right? Some of that comes from, Asians are so successful when they come over. And that was in a counter movement against, the civil rights movement. But it cements people thinking that Asian Americans are just intelligent, they're good at math, they're nerdy. And so they get pigeonholed into characters that are often be sexualized and undesirable. And so although Ned's a great character, again, we can be critical of this and say, why is he the sideline character in this situation? Why is Raj in that situation? Even though they're in a very similar set, right? And similar characteristics. And then a lot of times we're seeing that Asian men are effeminate and weak. And you can see that come up from those roles that were assigned to people in the 1800s. And then even moving forward, you might see that in current culture standards, right? K-pop and different pop culture references, a lot of times men are very effeminate. And so there's this image that continues to be portrayed, even though that's not necessarily the perception that is often portrayed. Part of the issue there as well is when we're seeing these effeminate and femininity and then masculinity traits, sometimes this is only viewed through a Western lens, right? And so through a Western lens, by saying these men are feminine, they're othering Asian American men. And so what does that become and how does that manifest itself in our culture and Western culture. And then another thing is Asian men are dangerous. Oftentimes, the darker your skin is, it will also impact the way someone is represented. And that's directly linked and tied to Blackness, right? And the racial segregation within that Western lens. So some things to think about. And then how does this impact us, right? So for a lot of Asian American men, this could appear as low self-worth, right? Not knowing what we're supposed to live up to, not knowing who we're supposed to be. And then a lot of times what happens is this reversal, right? And this overcompensation, and it emerges as toxic masculinity and misogyny. So in an attempt to regain masculinity, to feel strong, to feel like men to some degree, it basically boils down to dominance, and it can be about violence, and it can be about control. And so a lot of times what can happen is a concept that emerges is Asian women are owed to Asian men, right? We don't have anything else. So how's that gonna come forth? That an Asian woman, that should be mine. That should be part of what is part of my life. And so there's this double standard that happens when Asian men can date other women, can date white women, and that's celebrated. And you might see that, right? Like Raj gets together with Penny, or you might see other Asian characters. A lot of rom-coms, sometimes it'll be like that Henry Golding character gets with that white girl, or something and so forth, right? And it's like, oh, that's really great. And like Hollywood's kind of buying into that, where it's like, oh, this is a decent pairing, Asian man, white woman. But you'll see the opposite, right? When there's an Asian woman with a white man, there's a lot of backlash across social media, across different platforms, where people look down on that heavily. And internally, as a society, internally within different cultural backgrounds, if you date a white man, it's almost like race trading, right? And it's like, why would you choose a white man over your own race? And then there's this negative perception of that. And so, and there are several hateful forms that will discourage a lot of women for doing that. And why is that, right? And it's a sense of control. If you can't beat them, join them. And so there's a lot of negative perceptions against women, and that really feeds into potential violence. And as Joey noted already, that has a lot of dangerous implications. And so if we're buying into this as a society, what happens? And if we believe that foundation, that this is what we're supposed to be, and this is what we've learned, and we continue to engage with it, what does that become? And this is an example from an Asian masculinity Facebook group. It's basically just run the song, born too late to own property, born too soon to be a TikTok star, born just in time to have paid 99 cents for a ringtone, but never too late to sell out. And this is for the reason, is because she's married to Home Alone actor, right? And they have 2 kids together, and saying, oh, she just needs to marry a white man and she'll be fine. So where does that come from? And something we need to internalize and reflect on. So moving forward, the next question we have for you are what are
Before we move forward, I want to do a check with everyone, sort of see if we're all on the same page. Are there any questions, are there comments, anything that surprised you? Yes.
In the picture that you showed earlier, not just was it like the white man that the Asian man was standing over, but it was actually the girl from Manifest Destiny that was in the imagery. And so I also used that same picture for one of my presentations that I did for them at the winter retreat. So yeah.
Oh, so we've seen it again, right? So there's some information here that is reoccurring. It's good to know. Other thoughts? Yes.
I think it's interesting the perspective change of like especially K-pop, where people who are fans of K-pop and are part of the A kind of community are like men are kind of embracing gender stereotypes and breaking them because they're confident with their masculinity. Meanwhile, from a Western lens, they're seen as very feminine, and that's just kind of their perception. So it's just interesting how different backgrounds lead to different thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something this really interesting, like the growth of K-pop and the growth of like people starting to to consume this type of, music, this type of culture, and how that actually is shifting people's ideas of what masculinity actually is. And so you can say a lot of things about K-pop, but one of the good things about it is that some people are starting to change their ideas of what does it mean to be a man. And maybe it doesn't always look like what we used to perceive from a Western lens. Yes.
What I don't appreciate about that is that we celebrate like white individuals who do that. We celebrate people like Harry Styles who wears a dress or wears feminine presenting clothing, and we see that as like a marker of like improvement. But then when we look at Asian who are like, or like people who are in K-pop, we're like, oh, there's still that like dangling kind of lens of like femininity that we don't appreciate. But they've been doing this for much longer. They've already like kind of they understand they accept their masculinity, but we like garner or we like respect someone like Harry Styles who does it.
Yeah, it's true. Right. And it's like you think about it, and you're like, why? Like, why? It's racism. The answer is racism. I'm sure that wasn't a surprise to anyone. It's racism. And the over here.
I feel like in K-pop, I'm not very feminine, but I feel like there's still some masculine aspects. Like tall.
That's
I
true.
feel like beauty standards still include that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can say a whole bunch of stuff about the beauty standards as associated with being a K-pop star, and they're not all great, right? Being tall, being very pale skinned, looking a certain way, having your eyes a certain way, right? There definitely isn't the most healthiest sort of ideal for us to look towards, but I think at least it broadens the conversation, right? Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, being Korean, like K-pop, interesting because like you said, like there's masculine aspects, like they should be good at sports, they should have a six-pack,
Right,
maybe an eight-pack. They should have pecs and everything, muscles. But it's interesting with K-pop, like it's creating this like fetishization
Yes.
of especially
Yes.
Korean men, because like why seeing like we were talking about like Asian women with fetishized as well, right? Like we can hold both realities. It's just this interesting thing where like I think we ourselves as AAPI are capable of like fetishizing each other.
Yes.
So I know so many people that are like, oh, I only want to date a Korean man or a Korean woman, and they're like Asian. I'm like, there's so many. And like some people pass as Korean, and like some people don't pass as
Yeah.
Korean, but they are Korean. So
Exactly. Yeah.
why exactly do like Koreans?
And it's also just unrealistic because like they kind of do makeup and like styling kind of like to an extreme K-pop, so like,
Yeah.
Asian people don't really like it.
Right.
They do but don't. So it's
Yeah.
like,
It's not a plastic
so
surgery,
people are
right?
like, oh, I like Koreans when they just like K-pop and they don't actually like Korean.
Yeah, that's a fair
They're
point.
not actually around.
That's a fair point. What were you saying?
I wonder if there's like a difference between fetishization and having appreciation.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like there absolutely is, right? And then we're not gonna go too deep into this, but I teach an AAPI cultures course. And we have a whole section about how fetishization looks like today. And we talk about Ollie London. Do folks know about Ollie London? Yes, we talk about Ollie London. We talk about the fetishization of Asian men, about Asian culture as a whole. When does Asian culture become trendy and commodified, where the mainstream wants to pick it up as something they're interested in or picking up as a product, and then later discarding it, right? But to answer your question, there is, I can enjoy K-pop, I can love K-pop, but when I start saying things like, oh, I love Korean men, and I only think about BTS as what Korean men are, that's an issue, right? And it's like, why do you love Korean men? Because they look like BTS? No, that's wrong, obviously, that's a stereotype, right? So there definitely is a line. Okay, we're gonna switch gears, and I know we're like moving super fast. I know it might be feeling like a bit like whiplash, but we talked about Western society. How do they perceive us? Historically, why do they perceive us this way? What are the consequences for this? And now I want folks to look a bit more internally, right? In our cultures, whatever culture or ethnic background you come from, what is expected of you because of your gender, right? And we actually did talk about this a bit earlier too. I believe you were saying how Asian men are a bit more valued in some ways, right? But why is that? What is expected of an Asian man in our culture? What is expected of an Asian woman in our culture? Okay, yes.
I know for my family, my grandma was always bullying her kids on like your goal is to have a son.
because the son carries the family name later on, and the woman will not carry it afterwards, they'll change their name. And something that's really been impactful for my family is my mom has only had daughters. So my grandma doesn't see much happening for our family because they don't see women as capable as men. Like they don't see them carrying the family, being a bread holder, or having anything related to power.
Yeah. I think that's kind of wild, right? It's like in this day and age, women can decide to keep their last name when they get married too. It's not like it's impossible, right? Anyone else that can relate to that or have something similar to share?
I
See what
feel
I'm
like
nodding?
in my family, men and women are valued the same, but there's such an emphasis placed on marriage. Like your career is important, but getting married is as equally as important. Like I went to India over the winter holidays, and just to talk about marriage so casually was very shocking for me. You know, like they were talking about people who were unmarried. They were like, "Oh, I hope this person gets married. Otherwise, their life will be ruined." Yada yada yada. And I was like, "Why is marriage so important? Like, to have a good life, like,
Right.
you know."
Right. That's a good point. Other thoughts? Yes.
I've seen this a lot back then. I'm not really sure about now. For women, I feel like they're always expected to just take everything and never talk back. So like we can't voice our opinions or like disrupt the like family roles that we're given. Otherwise, we're like disrespectful, rude, or like not a model child. So,
Yeah, you have to obey the rules, right? Yes.
I think to add to that too, there was like a boys will be boys, same kind of ideal that there's in the Western world where it's like, oh, like he can do whatever he wants because he's the boy in the family, but you can't talk a certain way, you can't look a certain way, you have to dress a certain way, you can eat a certain way. So yeah, a boy in an Asian family can do whatever they want, but a girl had to be very like hyper conscious of her image.
Yeah, there's a difference in freedom, right? How many folks has this happened to, or have you known that this happened to, that in an Asian family, the boy gets to go out whenever they like, they can stay out past curfew, and then the girl, you best be home by 8, and if you go out this week, you cannot go out for the rest of the month. Yeah? Yeah? It's very common, right? This no, yeah, it's really common, this expectation that women are supposed to have this certain image, they're supposed to be more protected, more sheltered, whereas men have the opportunity to explore their lives. They can make mistakes, they can do whatever they like, not whatever, but you know where I'm coming from. How about men? What expectations are put on men? How about that?
You have to be, oh, sorry. Okay. You have to care for your whole family. You're the head of the family. You're not allowed to be emotional. You're not allowed to care about too much about anything.
Yeah, that's a lot, right?
I guess it's more like they're expected to do more heavy work. So like mowing the lawn or fixing a car or the masculine duties, meanwhile like housework was tending more to
Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts?
I think that it kind of held to a standard like a father to be at least like as good as him. You know? Not saying that that's kind of what happened with me, but it's kind of true with like a lot of, especially when they're like immigrant families and the fathers like who trying really hard to support. You better be doing your best, you know.
Right.
So yeah, you get that.
Right. I think there's for men, like what like we perceive as like a masculine Asian men, like the patriarch of the family, like you're saying, is unfeeling, stoic, makes decisions, a man of few words, right? They work hard, right? And I'm sure folks can start to see like how that's a dangerous concept, right? If you're not allowed to have feelings, if you're not allowed to express yourself, that can be very stunting,
And oftentimes, when we're looking at the emotional range of men and Asian American men, it can be boiled down to maybe 3 different emotions, maybe sadness, anger, and happiness. And if you're limiting someone's emotional range to maybe 3 emotions, what does that do internally? And it's not a surprise to me that 1 in 4 men have mental health issues, and it's a large percentage that may end their own lives. So, a big question to ask.
Yeah, other thoughts, other things that are expected.
Just more of like a societal norm to be straight.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this may be more niche, but with API men in the gay community, they're expected to be more simple.
Yeah, which is also interesting too, especially when we're looking at effeminate men and how that builds as a negative concept, and even more negative when you're talking about queer folks, right? And like how that portrays itself and how ostracized that community can be, because they appear so much more feminine, or they appear less masculine in some other ways.
Yeah, I think the question to ask is, right, what happens if you don't fit in the binary? What happens if you don't live up to these expectations? What happens if you're not straight? What happens if you don't like housework? What happens if you don't want to take care of the kids? What happens if you want to go out? What happens if you want to have emotions? What happens when you don't fit into this binary? That is not rhetorical. What do y'all think? Disowned.
It's very possible.
Yeah.
You can ignore it, but people sometimes just don't acknowledge your weakness. You're just there, but they don't acknowledge you.
Right. Ignored. What else?
I think family will so often like go with you until you decide to just follow the norm. So it's like you're either not in this family or you're going to.
Yeah. Yeah, you're forced to conform, right? This is the only way that you're allowed to be. You're shaking your head?
Oh,
Like,
I don't know. I
no, that's wrong, or?
Personally, I'm an agender pansexual individual, and I've just kind of been okay. But also, I'm an adoptee, so I don't have an Asian family, so they don't really force any of these stereotypes on me. Because like I've had to do all the manual labor in my house, but they also force me to do all the housework, so I just kind of had to do everything.
Do everything, yeah.
So they also like don't want me to have any emotions, and so I'm just kind of in so I just kind of tackle the world by myself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Because you have such a unique perspective, and you can see how those might differ from those perspectives that culturally that are placed on Asian American and Pacific Islander women and men. Thanks for sharing. Yes.
I think even like the emotional range in our cultures can be similar.
Yeah.
Definitely like children aren't allowed to express enough things. I feel like for Asian women, like we're not allowed to be angry.
Yeah.
I think that's the one that like is gonna solve it.
Yeah, you're not allowed to be angry. You're not allowed to be loud.
Yeah. Angry and strong.
Be disruptive.
My on my mother's side, they're mostly women. They're all Korean, very like energetic and expressive. But when they were growing up in Hawaii, they were in a household where they kind of like couldn't do anything, were forced to do every chore for like 7 years. So I think it's just like it is a very heavy expectation, especially if there's like an abusive white dude in the house. So yeah, I guess it's just an example of when this is very, and it's still true with like some of the newer generations of
Yeah.
They all ended up like just having to leave when they were young because it was just too much, and it like totally broke apart. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to see how this type of experience is on like a spectrum, right? It's like it's not. It's like there are like situations where there's no solution but to leave, and there are situations where we sort of just accept that's the way things are, and it's not the end of the world, but it's still not great. And I think that it's important to know that like maybe not all of these might relate to you or is expected to you, expected of you, but it's like a spectrum. There may be some things that you can relate with, right? And overall, there is a general trend of what is expected.
I think going back to the point of we talking about Asian American women not allowed to be loud.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of shared with a lot of minority communities in like Black, especially where Black women are acting kind of energetic and kind of, and they will call you like you're bossy
Yeah.
and call you like Black thug kind of stuff. And it's, I think sometimes the whites, let's just put it that way, so they don't like you speak. Like they don't want you to have the right to speak. They don't want to hear your voices. And as soon as you talk, they will evaluate you. And yes, just like coming from my personal experiences, like sometimes I used to work in journalism and also I publish articles and writing and stuff. They kind of look at it at a very, very different lens because you are Asian and you are women. So your point is like should be put into a very kind of strict view of examination.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that something that we're talking a lot about today is that there is so much weight on our shoulders of what is expected. Not only do we have to try in some way to fit into this, to keep family stability, right? Of course, all of us will want to be different in some different ways, right? But there is still some part of us that's like, okay, might as well just accept these expectations, right? Not only do we have to understand these, try our best to meet up to them, but we also have the wider Western society to contend with, who already perceives us certain ways, who already has stereotypes about Asian women and therefore will color their interactions with Asian women. So we're not only navigating internally our culture, our families, we have to navigate externally what's expected or what's perceived as an Asian woman or an Asian man. Any other thoughts, comments? Yes.
Going back to Ryan's point of kind of being bullied into fitting
Yeah.
expectations, the Western way of communication is a lot more direct and upfront, but in Asian culture, they're kind of more passive. So sometimes they'll be very passive aggressive, or they'll say things where you have to read between the lines to see their true intentions.
That's true.
Even working today, I can't look people in the eye. I don't directly look at people. I speak in a certain way and I speak in a certain manner. And that's learned behavior. And so these things will continue to manifest themselves whether we want to or not. But I think a part of it is like identifying it and understanding how we want to portray ourselves and be ourselves.
Okay, so we're moving into our last portion. We talked about Western society, Western perceptions, stereotypes associated with that, the consequences of that. We talked about our families, basically what they expect from us, right? What we are expected to do culturally. And now I want folks to have the opportunity to think about what do you want to see when it comes to Asian American masculinity and femininity. I know it's a very broad question, but we intentionally kept it broad because we want you to answer however you want. Maybe you spend the time answering about how the binary is an issue and we need to have more discussion about what is outside the binary, right? Or we can discuss about what does healthy masculinity look like? What does healthy femininity look like? Or we can discuss about what stereotypes you want to see broken in Hollywood, right? A lot of different ways that you can answer this question. And we're gonna do it this way. Have folks done a Mentimeter before? No? Okay, well, it's really, really easy. You're gonna go on your phones or your laptops or whatever you like. You can scan this QR code. You can go to menti.com, menti.com, and enter the code 49439760. Or you can scan it. The question basically is the same question. You can enter as many responses as you want. It is completely anonymous. You can be as broad or narrow or specific as you would like. And we're gonna spend the next, let's see, 5 or so minutes doing it. And then we'll end with our final discussion on looking towards the future. What does breaking through our gender roles look like?
2 more minutes to wrap up thoughts. Sorry.
Can you raise your hand if you're done? Give you another 30 seconds or so to finish up the thoughts. Thanks for sharing. All right, we're gonna slowly come back to our large group to discuss some of these things on here. There's a lot of trends I saw scrolling through. Y'all prefer the lights on or lights off? I can also turn on half lights. Let's give it a shot. That was not what I expected. Is this okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it would be a bit different if that maybe be half that way. Okay, anyways. So we have some folks are saying there's a few things that are talking about more representation with the media. That doesn't lead into stereotypes, it doesn't lead into fetishization, more Asian American in main character roles, more people maybe like Simu Lu. Oh, but he also confirms with Western beauty and art. But sort of finding this middle ground, moving away from the binary, accepting the gray areas between gender nuances, emotions, expectations, and cultural ideals, breakdowns from the norm. We would like to see men being able to express their emotions and resolve their problems without being seen as weak, right? We should be able to have conversations about how you're feeling without someone saying, oh, this man is weak because he has emotions. We all have emotions, right? The same expectations and standards for Asian men as women. So the same expectations and not one over the other. Again, some things about media, how it's improving but could be better. Want to create more diversity in the portrayal of masculinity and femininity. There is a desire for women to be respected and seen as equals. Gender is made up and a binary needs to be broken. Why does something need to be male or female and confine our action to a certain gender? Yes. Gender is socially constructed, right? What we believe to be gender roles, and when we talk about some of the things that were expected from our families and culture, those are socially created. They aren't biologically inherent. Women aren't biologically better at doing dishes, right? These are social roles that we have come up for ourselves. Girl boss Asian American woman, Again, more nuanced portrayals of Asian American identities in media, being able to express our emotions and voice without it being demonized. Less judgment in the community on how people wish to present themselves. Support between all genders. So men understanding the plights of women. So we want like men that understand feminism, right? We want women that also understanding the difficulties that men face to break down the norms and stereotypes established. We want to move beyond the stereotype that women are weak and lesser than or need to be domesticated. Understanding the negative connotation between masculinity and femininity. Being able to express them happily and be supported by their communities and families. Again, moving away from stereotypes. We have a standards of success aren't heteronormative marriage. Oh, this one. I think the stereotype that go with Asian American men and women will never go away. I think that is possible. Maybe not in our lifetime, right? But I think we have power in how we portray ourselves and how we move forward and perceive others to make a difference, right? Let's see. There should be more representation and awareness about what it means to be masculine and feminine. These should be discussed in classrooms. Again, another social construct and understanding the intersection between gender stereotypes and race. Notice that Asian men are frustrated and resentful from lack of respect. I want Asian men embracing their strength, going to the gym and being assertive while being mature and loving. So we're talking a bit about some healthy masculinity, right? What does it mean to be a strong man, right? And then I want to encourage folks to think beyond just like physical strength, right? What does it mean to be strong? What does it mean to be healthy as a man? What does it mean to be steadfast in your values while also being loving, right? Asian women don't owe Asian men anything to make up for the stereotypes of Asian men being less masculine. Yes, this is something we talked about, right? When with a lot of these stereotypes that were placed upon Asian men, a small subset of men overcorrect and believe that to be men, they have to be hyper masculine. They have to engage in toxic masculinity, that they have some sort of ownership over Asian women, or they want to punish Asian women for being in a different position, right? Acknowledgement of mainstream media issues such as Miss Saigon, yes. More flexibility in defining that feminine and masculine, and just more important about just being good people, right? Hope one day we don't need discussions like this in the future. That's fair. Understanding that people make mistakes, understanding what's right and wrong. Let's see, more appreciation. So again, a lot of common themes. For Asian American men specifically, less pressure from their families, but acknowledge and know that they also have to be responsible in certain aspects as a man. So that's some accountability, right? Decrease of double standards that exist in Asian American masculinity and femininity that often create resentment in their families. Intergenerational appreciation for people expressing both feminine and masculine traits. Like to see less violence against Asian women, of course. For Asian American women, I'm going to say that independent and that they also appreciate their families as a place to lean on. Ooh, thank you, everyone, for all of these answers. Every time my eyes are just like, when the lights turn on, it's like going outside after you've been inside for the whole day. I'd like to now open it up for general discussion. Like, how do folks feel about this? Are there things that you want to respond to on here? Are there things that you disagree with? Or are there things that you agree with? Is there anything that was surprising? Something that you want to take away with you today?
Something I want to add, I just thought of was brought up marriage, less on like the emphasis on like heteronormative marriage, and also like there's also a stigma in our community with divorce too.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention for the board, so there's just so much energy and pressure around.
Yeah, so people being able to be divorced, and that's okay. And women that are divorced shouldn't be seen as any lesser than women that have never been married, right? I think there is a stereotype when it comes to Asian American women and being a divorcee specifically. There are certain ways that society perceives them, right? Other thoughts?
I feel like, I don't know. YouTube and TikTok are good representation. Like real life people, like media. That's where I get my
Right, alternative streams of media, right? Alternative ways for people to truly be themselves and see different representations of folks that look like them. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes.
What do you wish to see?
What do I wish to see? That's a good question. While I was asking this, I didn't think about it. So I'll think about it now. I think I wish to see an acknowledgement of the gender roles within our cultures, right? In my family, I grew up very differently from my brother. There's also a big age gap, and my parents also made a lot more money when my brother was being raised, so that goes into it. But the fact of the matter is, he was raised very differently, right? And I would like to see more acknowledgement from my family and my brother that our experiences are different. And it's not a way to want to make my brother feel guilty or make my parents feel like they've treated me poorly, but just to acknowledge that, hey, you know, maybe things were a bit harder for you. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I appreciate that, right? I think that's something I like to see, like, with my family. I think outside of my family and my culture, what I'd like to see more of is more intersectional, like, representation. So really digging into different types of Asian American representation in media. Like, why don't we have more queer Asian Americans in media? You know, why don't we have more Asian Americans that identify as non-binary, or Asian Americans who are mixed race, right? Really having a more diversity of experiences, so people have this better idea that Asian Americans just aren't this stereotype and not a monolith, right? They are their own unique characteristics and people. How about you?
From my end, I think a lot of what I want to see is a recognition of biases, a recognition of kind of internal motivations and some of the roles that we grew up with, and trying to unlearn and relearn some of those situations. I would love to see a lot more men in therapy. I think therapy is a great way to unpackage some of the things that we grew up with and try to relearn and unconstruct very simple things. Like, I have anger issues. So it's like, how do I make that not a problem until it becomes potentially dangerous for other people, right? And acknowledging that that's an issue that I have, and I need to recognize that, and I need to work on it, and that's okay. And like, that's a very common trend with Asian American men. And it's like, how do we combat that? And how do we work together to strengthen ourselves in a different way? So, and I think that's helping school in a lot of ways.
I like to see less Asian American men going to that toxic masculinity, right? Understanding that Asian American women are not to blame for the way that Asian American men have been portrayed. That's what I would like to see too. Acknowledging that their role in perpetuating gender stereotypes too. I think that's something that sometimes we shy away from, right? Is that, yes, there are stereotypes placed on Asian American men, sure. There are like structural and societal difficulties that they go through, absolutely. But they also play a role in perpetuating them, right? Other thoughts? Okay, well, we have around 5 minutes left. What are some of your key takeaways from today? Like, if you're leaving this workshop with one thing that you want to remember, what is it that you want to remember? Or what is it that you want other people here to remember? Yeah.
Asking people, like, why do you like Asian women?
Mhm.
Because you usually just stop at like, oh, I like Asian women. Oh, okay. But I think asking it further.
And they'll be like, and if they say like, oh, it's the way they look, you can be like, what do Asian women look like? There's a lot of Asian countries, right? What is it? What do they look like, right? Good to ask questions, right? To help people sort of rethink what they're saying. Other thoughts? With that being said, then we'll probably close out. You have around 4 minutes left, and I think there's some food in the back. So I'm assuming that y'all will distribute the food whatever way works the best. Thank you everyone for your attention. We really appreciate it. We'll make sure to send out this information as well as our contact information if you want to talk to us. If you want us to come back for anything, we'd be happy to come back. We do a lot of different things like this. And also stick around a bit and probably eat some food too if you don't mind.
Our first announcement